When I first put together this forum series on prayer, it was really hard for me to figure out how to do it because there are so many voices we're not used to hearing from, like last week's Evagrius Ponticus. I'm sure that's not a name that trips off everyone's tongue. But on the other hand, Evagrius Ponticus has been enormously influential in forming Christian prayer and the practice of Christian prayer right up to today. So it was hard to figure out how to put together readings that would be accessible and inviting and somewhat intriguing, but also that would be responsible to the material. So you'll be glad to know we're finally leaving the 4th century. We spent a long time in the 4th century. We're moving to the 600s, so the 7th century. But you can tell that that period in the Mediterranean was where Christian spirituality really takes root and develops and becomes a kind of school, not even a kind of school, becomes a school of prayer, a school of contemplation. So there are all sorts of people who spend their entire life studying prayer. And one of the people that we're going to be reading today is one of them, John Climacus. Now, back in the day, people didn't have surnames. And so surnames are fairly recent, actually. So he was just John. But they called him Climacus after the name of his major book, which is called The Ladder of Divine Ascent. And as you know, Jacob's ladder is a favorite metaphor for the spiritual journey, but John Climacus is the one who really puts that on the map. And then people after that, like Walter Hilton in England, will imitate that. But he's, I think, the first author to use this ladder metaphor as a title for the whole book. And so he's a very, very important author, but he's in the 600s. So you see, we finally moved a few centuries down the line. We don't know much about his life. John Climacus, the word Climacus means ladder. That's what I was trying to say in Greek. It means, so he's John of the ladder. In other words, he's John who wrote the Ladder of Ascent. I think that's kind of interesting. So John Climacus was born sometime in the 500s. He died around 649. It seems that he entered into the monastery at about 16. We don't really know much about his life beforehand. If you read different sources, they say, oh, he was highly educated. Oh, he did this, he did that. I think a lot of that's just speculative, and in a way it doesn't matter anyway. He spent most of his life actually as a hermit right outside of St. Catherine's Monastery, which is at the base of Mount Sinai. And if you know the Sinai Peninsula, it's right in the center of the southern part of the Sinai Peninsula, probably right around the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, I think, in our current map. It is the oldest continuously occupied monastery in the Christian world. So he wound up joining what came to be a very venerable monastery. It was only opened in the 350s, so it was a rather late bloomer that way. He spent most of his life, as I said, decades of his life as a hermit outside of the monastery, but then toward the end of his life, they called him to be the abbot of the monastery, and he spent, I think, about the last 5 years of his life as the abbot. And while he was the abbot, another abbot wrote him and said, could you teach us about the spiritual life of the monk? Could you write us a treatise telling us how a monk should develop his spiritual life? And so he wrote The Ladder of Divine Ascent in response to that question, that query. And it's a book of 30 chapters, and they're all, these writers all have this kind of aphoristic way of writing. So as you can see from the reading, they write very short sentences as they advance their argument. He picked the number 30 because that's how old they thought Jesus was when he died. And so the Ladder of Ascent is following the life of Jesus up until the end. So you can see also there's a kind of move toward resurrection there in his thinking. The chapter on prayer is the second to the last. So you can see that prayer for him is the launch pad that leads to union with God. And then the final chapter is union with God. The mystical union with God. So what we're reading selections from the penultimate chapter of this book. So it'd be chapter 29, if you're counting. The Ladder of Ascent is incredibly influential. It's been translated into multiple languages right up to today. And interestingly enough, in the Orthodox monastic tradition, the entire book is read all the way through during Lent, every Lent. The monks hear the whole book. So this is especially important in Eastern spiritual tradition, but it's also important in the Western tradition. It's been very influential. In fact, going back to our friend Søren Kierkegaard, one of his best pseudonyms was a German philosophical theologian named Johannes Climacus, right? So he just Germanized the John, and it's John Climacus. So it's John of the Ladder in a Kierkegaard pseudonym. So that's in the 19th century. So that's how well known he has been. And the book, as I said, has been translated into multiple languages and right up to the present day. So it's a very interesting work. What's interesting is turning now to the reading, his definition of prayer is slightly different than what we saw in Evagrius, but it's related to it. Evagrius Ponticus defines prayer as a communion of the mind with God. And as we saw with Evagrius, he's very concerned to get rid of representation. He wants a representation-free kind of prayer life. That means conceptual, so language is a problem for Evagrius. Ideas are a problem for Evagrius. Images are a problem for Evagrius. We don't have the same problem with John Climacus. That's not his issue, but he has a very similar definition. Evagrius calls prayer a communion of the mind with God. John Climacus says right at the top of the first page, prayer by reason of its nature is the converse and union of man with God. So it's like communion of the mind with God or converse and union, they're pretty close. And by means of its action, upholds the world. Prayer upholds the world. I just think that's amazing, and brings about reconciliation with God. So I won't go through that whole opening paragraph, but it's really this kind of homage to prayer. It's really quite amazing. We'll look at the last sentences in it, the last phrases in it, but I just think that's a wonderful thing. So we'll see for John Climacus, prayer is not only converse with God, but it's converse leading to union with God. And we'll look at how he describes that really quite in a marvelous way. But the other thing about prayer that he highlights in a way that other authors don't necessarily do so is a prayer is a way of checking in on yourself and your relationship with God. Prayer is the way by which you begin to see yourself the way God sees you. So if you want to have an anticipation of what God's going to say to you on the last day, pray. But seriously, pray, because that's your participation in that judgment. So after his wonderful sort of homage, it's a crushing of conflict, a work of angels, food of the boldest, bodiless spirits, etc. Right toward the end, he says, prayer is the mirror of progress, the disclosure of stature, an indication of one's condition, a revelation of future things, and the future things have to do, I think, with our standing before God, and a sign of glory. And then this last line is really interesting. For him, and unfortunately it really would be him because he's writing for monks, for him who truly prays, prayer is the court, and he means that in a legal way. Prayer is the court, the judgment hall, and the tribunal of the Lord before the judgment to come. So in a way, when we pray, we're being arraigned, right? So, and it's a good thing, we want to know what the charges are now, right? Before it's too late. So, but I just find that to be really interesting, that prayer, when you pray, you come to the knowledge of yourself in a way that's actually the way you're reflected in the eyes of God, right? The way God sees you. Yeah.
Just to footnote that sense of judgment, which I think both for modern ears and postmodern ears feels like I may or may not make it. And certainly for Catholic ears, it's sort of scary whether I will or won't make it. And that power of manipulation and insecurity, which even if I'm not manipulated by somebody else, my own self-sense is that I may not or I never will make it. So that is the psychology of disordered Christianity. These monks kind of get off on scaring each other and being a little scared. That's because it's like their professional joy juice, right? As they look to Judgment Day. The reality is, I truly believe, is that with a God of all mercy, we are all going to make it. The issue is how we can learn to die before we die, How can we learn to be judged by an all-loving and all-merciful God before we're judged by an all-loving and merciful God? So this should be an encouragement rather than a threat. And if we can reframe that sort of 19th century pious guilt that is both Protestant and Catholic and evangelical, and get away from the Episcopal, Unitarian, liberal, it doesn't matter, all's gonna be fine, do what you want, when you want, as you want. All three of those frames fail. This is a really healthy, intense correcting with hope, faith, and love, and mercy overall. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Of the fear of the Lord.
The fear of the Lord.
In a good way.
In a good way, right, no,
way.
exactly. There's only one thing I'd add, and that is Episcopalians have to do things with decorum, right? It doesn't matter what you do, just do it well, you know? And don't eat your whole meal with the salad fork. That's it, you know, that's it. So anyway, and certainly don't eat the finger bowl. I did that by mistake once. Anyway, but going to that point, thank you for that too, because we'll see how important the mercy of God is for Climacus, and this has been true all along, interestingly enough. If you turn the sheet, I probably should have moved this up, but it was number 33 and 34. He follows up on this idea of coming to know yourself in light of a merciful God. So the judgment is in light of God's mercy. And so in number 33 there, right toward the bottom, he says, war proves the soldier's love for his king, but the time and discipline of prayer show the monk's love for God. So what you're actually testing is your love for God. You're not actually asking, does God love me? It's what you're trying to discern is, do I actually love God? I know God's merciful. I know God is loving. Do I love God, right? And then I love this. Your prayer will show you what condition you are in. That's probably why I avoid it, right? Theologians say that prayer is the monk's mirror. And I just think that's a beautiful image. So prayer is a monk's mirror, so the monk learns, and then this text, by the way, was used very quickly outside of the monasteries. So his audience is obviously these monks in another monastery, but there were lay people found this to be incredibly helpful themselves. So prayer is the Christian's mirror. Prayer is the human's mirror. Actually, you could even extend it further. So I just think that's a really interesting theme we haven't seen quite put out that way, that prayer is a kind of barometer, testing what level your love for God is, and the amount of time you spend in prayer. He also has this very interesting sort of sorting out of three different kinds of prayer that's in the second quote on the first page again. And I love the images. He says, those whose mind has learned true prayer, and we saw that idea with Evagrius, so there's this idea of true prayer. We'll have to tease out what he means by that. Those whose mind has learned true prayer converse with the Lord face to face. And that's very much like Moses. So what they want to do is they want to talk to God the way Moses talked to God, as if speaking into the ear of the emperor. And if you speak into the ear of the emperor in the 7th century, you're speaking as the emperor's greatest confidant. So there's this intimacy in this relationship. You're speaking face to face with the emperor, you're speaking right into his ear, and no one else is around, right? It's a one-on-one conversation. He says, those who make vocal prayer, and that's what we're the most familiar with, fall down before the emperor as if in the presence of the whole Senate, right? Or fall down before God, as if in the presence of the whole Senate. So vocal prayer, now you're, I think, invoking the angelic host when you're praying, and so it's a little less intimate, a little less effective. And then he says, but those who live in the world, right, petition the emperor amidst the clamor of the crowds. So we're not speaking in the ear of the emperor, we're actually out there on the streets of Paris, you know, the barricades, speaking in the clamor of the crowd. So he clearly prioritizes true prayer as being a face-to-face conversation or whispering into the ear of the emperor, that kind of metaphor. So he does have that kind of monastic, even hermit hierarchy of relations with God. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. But he's not as worried about mental representation as Evagrius was. In fact, for him, language is absolutely critical to prayer, because language is what helps us to draw our disordered mind into order. It helps us to focus our thoughts so that we're not just skittering across the water like a skipping stone or jumping from thing to thing. I try to trap spiders in our house when I come across them because they're very good for our environment. And I got one, a little black spider, he was a jumper, right? So that's my mind, boom, off over that way. So anyway, so he wants us to use language, but he doesn't want us to use a lot of language. Because we can get, and Jesus didn't either, so he's just echoing Jesus at this point. So in that third section, at number 5, let your prayer be completely simple. And the hesychast tradition in the Greek world, in the Orthodox world, is very much like this. They take a very simple phrase, and their favorite one was the tax collector, right? Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. That's about as loquacious as they want us to get, right? So he says, let your prayer be completely simple for both the publican, that would be the tax collector, and the prodigal son. Father, I'm not worthy to be your son. So again, appealing to mercy. Both prayers appeal to mercy. We're reconciled to God by a single phrase. Do not be over-sophisticated in the words you use when praying, because the simple and unadorned lisping of children has often won the heart of their heavenly Father. So you can see now, actually, an non-monastic audience might feel like he's saying something to us, right? That's probably why he's been read that way. And don't try to be verbose when you pray. Not because you're just showing off, I think sometimes that's what Jesus thinks we're doing when we're verbose, but he says, lest your mind be distracted in searching for words. So if you're trying to be eloquent and, construct a really beautiful paragraph, well, then you're not praying anymore, you're writing, right? You're composing. So you're distracting yourself from prayer by composing a long and eloquent prayer. One word of the publican propitiated God, so it wasn't one word, but it was, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And one cry of faith saved the thief. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He said, today you will be with me in paradise. Talk about effective prayer, right? So the most effective prayers we see in the New Testament are very simple declarative sentences. Loquacity in prayer often distracts the mind, you can see the problem, and leads to fantasy, so we just start imagining things, whereas brevity makes for concentration. So I think that's a really nice point he's making there, that now I feel like he's talking to me, And I know when we're asked to pray, for instance, those of us who are kind of in the religious profession sometimes get asked to pray, and people are waiting for this barn-burning, tear-jerking, incredible performance, and it's really hard to get out of that mode. It's really hard to say, okay, they just asked me to pray, so I'm going to pray. I'm not going to perform. I'm going to pray. In the Episcopal Church, we have beautiful prayers, which makes it even harder to pray without performing. But I think that's a really interesting point that he's making.
And just to interject piety, which is to say the practice of prayer, is what we're doing every day of the week in our meditation and in our yoga, which is not using words. But you can't not use words, which is what the genius of mantra-based prayer and meditation is, which is using one word or a simple phrase in order to let go of the besetting mind that wants to constantly use words to climb the ladder instead of commune. These are completely different gears than 95% of Christians, 99% of Christians in this country have any concept of at all. And that's why, let alone go to a church that actually practices the practice of prayer outside of worship or intercession. And if we think about that simple pious practice of lighting a candle and trusting in that mystical communion of a candle flickering in the dark, now you can do that as cheap grace. Put a buck in the little slot, lit a candle, walk away, I've done my job, and my prayer mirror could be pretty foggy and messy. Or That is getting towards what we're getting towards in what Randall is saying. And this is just thrilling. Carry on.
Or a broader concept. Because when you do it intercession in the old timey way, Lord, do this, build it, you are forming concepts. And concepts are things that get in the way of real good communal prayer.
No, that's right,
Oftentimes,
yeah.
doesn't it?
No, that's right. So this is the danger. And on the other hand, sometimes people speak from the heart in a way that's just incredible, right? So it's not to say that you shouldn't make the best effort to pray, but remember what it's about. It's about converse and union of human beings with God. So it's about directing myself and everyone else into this intimate relationship with God, which is a very different thing than a lot of the barn burning prayer we get, especially in sort of free church traditions. You get pastoral prayers that are basically sermon part 2. And you realize they're not talking to God at all, they're talking to me, right? You get a prayer that's actually a lecture. So this is really important. To whom are we speaking when we pray? And I'm including myself maybe especially. It's really hard not to, when you're with, especially when you're praying with other people, not to make that your focus rather than directing us, myself, and everyone else to God. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So the question is, does he have any advice for praying collectively? As you can see, he's mainly a hermit, who's now an abbot of a monastery. And so when he thinks of prayer, he's thinking of praying alone. And the more you get people around, the weaker the prayer. You could see that in terms of you're appealing to the Senate or your crowd out in the street protesting, in terms of that second quote. That's why I put that in there. So for him, clearly communal prayer is important. It's in a monastery, that's basically what they do. But he would still say that the height of prayer, I'm sorry, I get this thing in the morning, especially with I use Flonase and everything, but I get this kind of allergy thing, so excuse me for that. But he would say that prayer is primarily an individual's converse and union with God. But in our communal prayer together, the more we remember that, the more that will be a kind of prayer. It'll be, for him, I'm not going to try to, romance him into a position he doesn't have. For him, that's a circle outside of the central circle. But it's not irrelevant because the monks prayed together, right? Especially the Psalms. But they would also pray in their cells. And so for him, it's the way they interact. There's actually a quote toward the end, I think. No, that was a vagarious, sorry. They were always interested in the relationship between the Psaltery, where they go through the Psalms basically once a week, and then prayer. And they distinguish between the two, interestingly enough. So the Psaltery, they're praying together, but they didn't really call that prayer. It's a kind of prayer, but that's not when they say prayer, they mean something else. So prayer is what happens when I'm alone with God. I think for him, that's true. But the more you pray like that, then when we're together, it changes things. Like you can tell somebody who prays alone when they pray in public, because they're not conscious of the audience. It's not an audience, right? They're inviting you into your relationship with God, and saying, enter into that yourself. Don't use me. I'm the occasion for you to address God yourself. Whisper into the ear of the emperor, or sit across from God and talk to God like a friend face to face, as Moses would say. First of all, it's daily practice, right? Or at least weekly practice, A. And then B, speaking from the heart, right? And then finally speaking to God, right? And when we do that, God's not impressed with the show, right? We know that. The one thing Jesus is against over and over again is hypocrisy, putting on a good show. But it's a beautiful thing when you encounter it, actually. And I'm an Episcopalian, right? I'm a Book of Common Prayer guy. So when people say, Randall, would you offer a prayer? I'm like, okay, where's the book? And it doesn't even have to be the Book of Common Prayer. It could be Erasmus's prayer or whoever, So I'm very nervous doing extemporaneous prayer. But people who do it well, it's really quite beautiful, actually. And it's very moving because you're hearing something that you ordinarily wouldn't hear. You're hearing the way he or she prays to God, right? And so we'll do Meister Eckhart next month, by the way, one of my favorite people on prayer. And Patsy got Patsy's attention here. We love Meister Eckhart. But he says at one point, why are you asking me to pray for you? The treasure's in yourself, right? So pray. Don't have me pray for you, pray. So I think sometimes we need that encouragement too. So he was very worried about collective prayer, but we're not talking about him today. But the thing is about let your prayer be completely simple. There's a beauty to that that's really, I think that's what you're speaking to, right? When somebody prays that way, my father-in-law prays that way, and he was raised on a farm, and so it's just very down to earth, but just solid gold stuff that he says. It's right out of his heart, right? So it's a beautiful thing that way. Well, there's a paragraph on the work of prayer is one and the same for all. That's the next one. But there are many kinds of prayer and many different prayers. So I like that, actually. You got the feeling with Evagrius there's one kind of prayer, this non-representational prayer. But as I said, John Climacus is not as worried about the multiplicity of prayer. He's not as worried about language. And everyone has a prayer. Their prayer will differ. Even the same person will pray differently. But different people have different ways of praying. And he's like, that's not a problem. But there is work. The work of prayer is one and the same for all. The work of prayer is this converse and union with the human being and God, right? But I like the fact that he's aware that there are different kinds of prayer, including the examples he gave. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom is different than Father, I'm not worthy to be your son, which is different than Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. They're all appeals to mercy, but they're all different forms of that. I'm always interested too in number 7, how people want us to order our prayers. Like, what's the order of how we should go about praying? Because there's invocation, there's thanksgiving, there's petition, there's confession. We saw with Evagrius last week, he wants us to open with compunction and tears, right? Again, going to the point about mercy. So for Evagrius, you approach God as a sinner in need of mercy, no matter where you are on your journey. For Climacus, he wouldn't deny that, but it's not the first thing. I think this is really amazing. The first thing is thanksgiving. So before you say anything else, you thank God. Talk about putting you in a posture of humility, right? Yeah, I've already received everything, and now I'm going to approach you in gratitude, right? And then I'm going to confess my sin. And then I'm going to ask for something, right? So I've already received, you give me everything. I am a sinner who doesn't deserve anything, and now I'm asking you for this, right? Now I'm petitioning you. So before all else is number 7, right toward the bottom. Let us list sincere thanksgiving first on the scroll of our prayer. I like that. And the second line, we should put confession and heartfelt contrition of soul. Then let us present our petition to the King of all. This is the best way of prayer. And he says it was shown to one of the brethren by an angel of the Lord. I don't know what that story is. If anyone does, you can let me know. But it seems to have been a contemporary spiritual experience that somebody had. And then emphasizing that, you know, he starts with thanksgiving, but then just a few phrases down, or a few sentences down, though you may have climbed the whole ladder of the virtues, and remember we're in chapter 29, so there are a lot of virtues under the monk's belt by now, pray for forgiveness of sins, right? So you're always approaching God from a posture of being a sinner in need of mercy. Listen to the cry of Paul regarding sinners, Paul says, of whom I am chief. Right? So the Apostle Paul is the chief of sinners. If you are clothed in all meekness and freedom from anger, you will not have much trouble in loosing your mind from captivity. Be very merciful if you care about prayer. I just love that line. Be very merciful if you care about prayer. For through mercy, monks shall receive 100-fold, and the rest in future life. We've seen this over and over and over again. The one thing about that all of these writers are unanimous about is anger, revenge, anything that's not merciful. Anything that's not merciful is a severe danger to the spiritual life. And the way you get back to mercy is praying for the forgiveness of sin. And I also think praying with thanksgiving, right? So thanksgiving, forgiveness, petition. And then it would just start all over again. If God answers your prayer, then thanksgiving, forgiveness, petition. So there's this marvelous sentence I ended with. I don't really know what to do with it because it's just so charming. He says, until we have acquired genuine prayer, and so notice there is something called genuine prayer we may not have gotten to yet, we are like people teaching children to begin to walk. So we're all kind of stumbling around the furniture, right? Which he acknowledges, right? So we're all having our issues, and we're sort of like children learning how to walk. I think that's really a delightful image. Well, going back to the language thing then, so what do you do if you're struggling in your prayer? Right, what do you do? This is what I love about him. He's writing for people on all levels of the path, even though he's in chapter 29, so we're right near the end. He says, try to lift up, this is on the next page, or rather to enclose your thought. This goes to what David was saying. To lift up, or rather to enclose your thought within the words of your prayer. Right, so he's not nervous about language the way Vagras was. He actually wants us to enclose our thought within the language. If it's simple, again, going to that point, if the language is simple, that will actually help you focus and not be distracted. But enclose your thought within the words of your prayer. And if in its infant state it wearies and falls, again, we're children learning how to walk, clunk, and over we go, lift it up again. Like, don't beat yourself up about it, just lift it up again. Instability is natural to the mind. So he's very honest about how hard it is actually to do this. But God is powerful to establish all things. And now he uses the image of water. One of the ways by which Israel knew that Yahweh was the Lord, the King, the ruler of the universe, is Yahweh controls water. And as we're learning in California now, no one else does, right? They just figured there's a lake in California that's been dry forever. Let's farm it. So we plowed it up, planted all this stuff in there, pistachios, etc. It's filling, right? There are feet of water in this lake now. So controlling water, we have this fantasy we control water, we don't. So for John Climacus, the best metaphor for the distracted, disturbed mind is water. And the best way to understand God's relationship to that is God's control of water. So he says, instability is natural to the mind, but God is powerful to establish all things, including let there be dry land. If you persevere indefatigably, great word, in this labor, he who sets the bounds to the sea of the mind will visit you too, and during your prayer will say to the waves, thus far ye come and no further. Right, so God will come in and say, stop, right? This instability needs to stop here. Spirit, and here he means human spirit. Spirit cannot be bound. We can't do it. We can't bind our spirit. But where the creator of spirit is, everything obeys. So call God in. If you persevere in prayer, God will come in and give order to your mind. So you don't have to, just completely lose it, because that would actually cause even more instability, that you're getting very frustrated. Then he also has this, in the next paragraph, you can see this kind of progression. So in this level, in 17, we're basically still at the beginning of prayer. So he says in sentence 19, the beginning of prayer consists in banishing by a single thought the thoughts that assault us at the very moment that they appear. That's really interesting. So when you have a whole bunch of thoughts, that's why being simple is an advantage. When a whole bunch of thoughts assail you, like they do with me at about 5 a.m, at this point, there's a tsunami of stuff that just comes in, then you just try to find a single thought to banish all these other thoughts, right? So the beginning of prayer consists in banishing by a single thought the thoughts that assault us at the very moment that they appear. The middle stage consists in confining our minds to what is being said and thought. So that's again enclosing your thoughts within the words. And its perfection is rapture in the Lord. Right? So its perfection is when you transcend language, when you transcend thought. And that is where he's like a Vagras at this point. So pure prayer for him, the perfection of prayer is when you transcend thought, when you transcend language. But the way there is by means of thought and language. So you're banishing by a single thought the thoughts that assault us at the beginning, and then you confine your mind to what is being said in thought in the prayer. We saw that earlier, enclose your thought within the words of your prayer. And then the goal of that is this rapturous experience of unity with God. So you can experience unity with God in this life. right? And that's what prayer is for. So prayer is a road by which we travel by our words and our thoughts to be united to God. And he gets at this point very strongly in the next paragraph, where he has a very different kind of way of describing prayer. There's a psalm that all of the people we've been reading so far love. And there's a line from the psalm that they quote over and over again. Who have I in heaven beside you? And earth has nothing that I want beside you. So there's nothing in heaven I want besides God, and there's nothing on earth I want beside God. And so this is John Climacus's riff, if you will, on that verse from the Psalms. He says, rise from love of the world and love of pleasure, lay aside cares, strip your mind, renounce your body, because prayer is nothing other than estrangement from the world, visible and invisible. So by prayer you become a stranger in the world, both in heaven and on earth. I just think that's, of all things visible and invisible, well, you're a stranger to all of it when you pray. Why? For what have I in heaven? Nothing. What have I desired on earth beside thee? Nothing. And then this line just kills me. But to cling continually to thee in prayer without distraction. Prayer is clinging to God. This idea comes from Deuteronomy, in which Moses tells the Israelites to cling to God and not to Baal and the other deities in Israel. And this clinging, this verb to cling, is a husband or a wife clinging to one another. So it's a very intimate, loving verb that he's using here. Cling to the Lord continually in prayer without distraction, right? So that's the goal of prayer, is to cling continually to God. To some, wealth is pleasant, to others, glory, to others, possessions. But my wish is to cling to God. That's an amazing statement. My wish is to cling. I've not heard anyone actually describe prayer as clinging to God. It's just I love that in Deuteronomy, by the way, that image of the Israelites clinging to God like the way you would cling to your partner or your spouse. It's really quite a beautiful thing. And to put the hope of my dispassion in him. So all of my hopes and longings would be in God. He also raises this issue we saw with Evagrius about what happens when I feel like I've engaged in prayer for a long time and it just feels utterly futile and fruitless, right? Because nothing resulted from it. Of course, again, we're seeing prayer in an instrumental way then, and not as an end in itself. For Climacus, prayer is an end in itself. I mean, the end of prayer is God, right? So what else would you want? So he says, do not say, after spending a long time at prayer, that nothing has been gained, for you have already gained something. And what higher good is there than to cling to the Lord? There we go again. Than to cling to the Lord and persevere in unceasing union with him. So by prayer you cling to God and you are united to God. So in a way, he's already anticipating chapter 30. The way to get to chapter 30 is by prayer. And then in chapter 30, he simply describes what it's like to be united to God or what it's like to cling to God. It's just, I think that's, the intimacy of that language just blows me away, honestly, especially for this celibate monk out in the middle of the wilderness. It's really quite something. Well, I want to have more time for discussion, so I won't go through everything else. But it is interesting, in 31, he has this idea we saw in Origen, that prayer is primarily what you do when you're standing up. So in this monastic tradition, prayer is standing probably in your cell, but to prepare for that, pray at all times, right? So you should pray at all times so that when the time of prayer comes, the set time of prayer comes, you're prepared. So that's a very interesting idea, that praying all the time is not the same as praying at set times. And if you pray all the time, then you'll be ready for the time of the set time of prayer. But the final quote, and that's the one I want to close with, is after all of this teaching about prayer, and we're now at paragraph 64, after all of this teaching about prayer, he tells you, you don't really want me for your teacher. You want God for your teacher, right? It's really interesting. He says, have all courage, and you will have God for your teacher in prayer. Just as it is impossible to learn to see by word of mouth, right, unless you have eyes, because seeing depends on one's own natural sight, So it is impossible to learn the beauty of prayer from the teaching of others, including him, right? Prayer has a teacher all its own, God, and that teaches man knowledge and grants the prayer of him who prays and blesses the ears of the just. Amen. That's what the chapter closes with that thought. I just think that's incredible. After all of this teaching on prayer, which has been found to be incredibly useful through the years, John Climacus tells us, oh, by the way, there's only one teacher of prayer, and that's God. So if you want to learn how to pray, pray, and God will teach you how to pray. So what you're doing when you're praying to God is not only conversing with God and not only seeking union with God, but you're also being taught by God how to pray. And all of us will have a slightly different education in that way, which is why I think he says the work of prayer is one and the same for all, but there are many different kinds of prayer because our relationships with God are unique, and each of us has to learn what that's about. So I just think that's marvelous. It's better at the end, you know. You almost feel like he pulls the rug out from under the whole thing, but in a way he doesn't. Because you go through all of this progression and clinging to God and all this stuff, and then he says at the end, oh, by the way, don't listen to me at all. I can't teach you how to pray. So maybe that's why we're like people teaching children how to walk. That until we're taught by God how to pray, we're not really learning what we need to be learning. When God tells Adam, for this reason, when he says, this at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, then the author says, for this reason a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh, right? So this clinging goes all the way back to Genesis. And so, but the real clinging should be God, right? So who have I in heaven but you? Earth has nothing that I want besides you. Anyway, so thank you for that, Tim. And thank you for coming this morning. And thank you for moving forward as David has instructed us. We obey the rector. We definitely obey the rector. Thank you. So we're off the next couple weeks, and then we start again May 14th with another rather unknown but really important figure, Maximus Confessor.